afternoon, everyone. I'm Liz Cohen. I'm Dean of the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study, and it is a pleasure to welcome you to today's lecture by Professor Michael Kazin. Here at Radcliffe, we are dedicated to promoting new research and inquiry, and we bring leading scholars, scientists, artists, and public intellectuals from all of Harvard schools and from around the world to share their work with each other and with broad, interested public like you. Today's talk is part of our Davis Lecture Series, established by Kim and Judy Davis to bring prominent thinkers in all fields here to Radcliffe for public talks. I am so glad to see Kim and Judy here with us today, and I'm grateful to them for their generous support of the Institute. Now, today, our speaker is Professor Michael Kazin, who will enlighten us on the very important topic of, does the left have a future? Mike is uniquely qualified to tackle this question because he is a rare historian who is just as engaged in contemporary politics as he is in the politics of the past. Almost exactly 1 year ago today, the presidential election of 2016 caused many Americans on both the left and the right to question their assumptions about American politics. Even before Election Day, the campaign revealed deep divisions, not only between blue and red voters, but within the Democratic and Republican parties themselves. There are many examples that illustrate these intra-party divides, but I'll remind you of just one telling anecdote related to the Democratic Party. Only hours before the Democratic National Convention opened last summer, Senator Bernie Sanders spoke to a crowd of his supporters, calling on them to support the party's presumptive nominee for president, Hillary Rodham Clinton. Sanders' words were met with such loud booing that he was forced to stop speaking and then adamantly insist, and I quote him, "This is the real world that we live in," end quote. That particular moment spoke to a dilemma and a divide that would continue to plague the Democrats throughout the fall's presidential campaign, and that persists as the party prepares for the next presidential contest in 2020. Under a Trump administration, it's clear what the left is advocating against. But what, if anything, unites a disparate opposition that spans from moderate liberals to farther left and populist wings? How wide a tent can left-leaning challengers gather under? What should they advocate for? And what should their next steps be? These questions are likely what brought so many of you here today, and you may feel that you and other like-minded Americans are facing an historic crisis that calls for brand new answers. Or maybe you like the direction the country is going, and you are here to learn how to ensure that the left does not have a future. Either way, I imagine that we will learn from Mike today that it is far from the first time that the left, or the right for that matter, has fragmented, grappled with challenging internal divisions, and had its future survival questioned. Let me just offer two historical precedents. In 1948, Henry Wallace and his Progressive Party split with the Democrats, led by then-President Harry S. Truman, and advocated for national health insurance and expansion of the social safety net, as well as greater racial desegregation and a more conciliatory foreign policy, among other issues. In that same election, then South Carolina Governor Strom Thurmond and his segregationist Dixiecrats challenged Truman and Republican candidate Thomas F. Dewey from the right. 2 decades later, in 1968, profound divisions again emerged within the Democratic Party when President Lyndon Baines Johnson and later his Vice President Hubert Humphrey were challenged on the left, first by Minnesota Senator Eugene McCarthy, and then also by New York Senator Robert Kennedy. And interestingly, in that same election, George Wallace, a former Democratic governor from Alabama, mobilized significant support from Southern and blue-collar Northern Democrats for his third-party candidacy for president. With eerie echoes of today, Time magazine in October 1968 described Wallace's supporters as, and I quote, a coalition of frustration, end quote, who refused to believe what they read in the newspapers and magazines. Wallace himself actively stirred up racial animus and frequently railed against government bureaucrats, intellectuals, and the press. I hope I have made my point that historical perspective can be helpful in understanding the complexities of our current political moment. I say this not in support of the old cliche that history repeats itself, but because history can suggest new questions and encourage rigorous analysis. With that goal in mind, I am delighted to welcome Michael Kazin to the Radcliffe Institute today. Mike is a leading historian of the American left. He is a professor in the Department of History at Georgetown University, as well as the editor of Dissent, a magazine that has been influencing American political thought since its first issue in 1954. Under Mike's leadership, Dissent has aggressively reached out to new audiences, particularly younger ones, and it is now addressing a wide range of issues relevant to them. Dissent magazine, under Mike's leadership, may in fact have some important lessons to teach the American left as it seeks to redefine itself and secure a future. Mike is renowned for his extensive research and writing. One theme that ties his wide-ranging body of work together is attention to uncovering the coherent ideology of both the left and the right, powerfully reminding us that ideas, not just interests, matter in American politics and political history. Mike is the author or editor of 10 books. He's especially well known for The Populist Persuasion in American History, as well as America Divided, the Civil War of the 1960s, which he co-authored with Morris Isserman. Mike's most recent book, entitled War Against War, The American Fight for Peace, 1914 to 1918, examines the often forgotten resistance to the United States entering World War I. And he is now at work on a new book entitled Making Democrats, From Andrew Jackson to Barack Obama and Beyond. So here's how this afternoon will work. Mike will deliver his lecture, and there will be time for brief Q&A. We will put a microphone in the center aisle, and if you would like to ask a question, please come up, identify yourself, and then ask your question. After the final question, I invite you to join us for a reception next door in the sheer room on the first floor of Fay House. Now, please join me in giving a warm welcome to Michael Kazin. I'm so glad you're finally here.
Thanks very much, Liz, and thanks everybody for coming. I hope to be true to that wonderful introduction and provoke you politically as well as historically. And thanks also both to Liz and to everyone at the Institute who's been wonderful in organizing this. This is one of the best run institutions I've ever been associated with, even in a temporary fashion. It's also a great honor to be here because, as some of you know, this is Liz's last year as dean, so this is one of the last dean's lectures that she'll be presiding over. And thanks to Liz and her staff, the Institute plays a really significant role in the intellectual life of the Boston area, and I think of the nation as well. The Schlesinger Library is a first-class library. The fellowship program is a wonderful program. And of course, they sponsor all kinds of events like this. And thanks too to Kim and Judy Davis for helping to support the Institute so well. Does the left have a future? Well, before answering, I better perform that quintessential academic move and define my terms. As U.S. politics moved rightward over the past 4 years, the term left has become so capacious that it threatens to lose all meaning. For most conservatives, and I think most journalists, the left spans everybody from a moderate Democrat, like, say, Senator Claire McCaskill of Missouri, and media outlets like MSNBC and the New York Times and the Washington Post, to the black hood and anarchists of Antifa and the Revolutionary Communist Party, a tiny group which still reveres the thought of Joseph Stalin and Mao Zedong. My definition is a more narrow and, I think, more traditional one. The left comprises those people and groups which advocate or have been strongly influenced by some form of what for almost 200 years has been called socialism. Now, socialism is a very capacious term as well. There's democratic socialism, social democratic socialism, liberal socialism, and totalitarian socialism. As often true in his work, George Orwell put the aim of all socialists, of all these varieties, most succinctly and elegantly. Here's a very dapper picture of George, so very different than most of the ones you see. I just chose one that made him look like a, sort of somewhat upper-class Englishman. In homage to Catalonia, that great book about the Spanish Civil War and his participation in it, Orwell reflected, quote, "What attracts ordinary men to socialism and makes them willing to risk their skins for it is the idea of equality." Now, of course, there have been exponents of a thoroughgoing equality who did not identify themselves as socialists. Radical feminists, for example, anarchists, some black nationalists, some left liberals as well. But when they made and make a critique of unequal conditions and cultural prejudices, and they touched on matters of political economy, they sounded quite similar to what socialists have long said about that subject. So socialism has a drawing power, I think, analytically, that helps to define what it means to be left. Now, few people in or outside the left today, especially since the Great Recession, would argue that the causes of either socialism or equality are thriving. In Europe, for example, the share of the vote won by socialist and social democratic parties, which once governed such nations as France, Germany, the Netherlands, and Austria, alone or in coalition, has declined, and quite precipitously, as you see. This graph shows you the beginning of roughly a little bit after the Great Recession. You see, whoop, all the way down. If your stocks looked like that, you'd sell them, or you would wish you would have sold them earlier. In Scandinavia, whose generous and culturally tolerant welfare states once seemed as durable as the Arctic ice cap, a coalition of the left governs only in Sweden today. And the Social Democrats there hold fewer than a third of the seats in parliament, their lowest percentage in almost a century. There are new left parties emerging in some of these nations: Podemos in Spain, Jean-Luc Mélenchon's party in France, the Left Party in Germany. But none of these parties is close to gaining a plurality of votes in a national election. In Latin America, nearly everywhere, the vaunted pink tide that was brought ashore a decade ago, and somewhat earlier, by figures like Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, Rafael Correa in Ecuador, has ebbed away. It was plagued by grandiose promises, ineffective administration, and low prices for the commodities on which nations like Venezuela and Ecuador continue to rely. In Brazil, largest, most important nation in Latin America, former President Lula da Silva, the founder of that nation's once dominant Workers' Party, is leading in polls for the presidential election to be held next year. But if his conviction for graft is upheld on appeal, Lula would likely be barred from running at all. In neither Africa nor the Middle East is there more than a trace of the third world socialism that radicals in the first world, like me, once hailed as the hope of the future. Where educated young people frustrated by a lack of jobs and a voice in their governments once looked to socialist texts for political guidance and inspiration, many now turn to a rigorous form of Islam that befits what Pankaj Mishra has aptly called the age of anger. Now, after listening to this dismal survey, some of you may be thinking, he's left out his own nation, as well as the country from which the United States won its independence. What about these guys? What about the surprising vote total won by Jeremy Corbyn and his Labour Party in the past election in Great Britain? What about the growth of membership in the Labour Party since he took over its helm a couple years ago? What about the surge of support for Bernie Sanders last year in his campaign, the remarkable appeal he has to young people across racial lines? One poll taken this September found, again remarkably, that Bernie Sanders' popularity rating, approval rating, I should say, was 75%. The most prominent Democratic socialists in U.S. history, Eugene Debs, Norman Thomas, all of whom ran for president multiple times, never enjoyed anything close to that level of popularity. Of course, neither Thomas nor Debs ever ran for president as a Democrat. But it's also true that the largest socialist organization in the country, Democratic Socialists of America, has gained over 20,000 members since Sanders began his presidential campaign 2 years ago. They have about 30,000 members now. So isn't socialism undergoing a major revival that might give a new meaning to the special relationship between two English-speaking nations? Perhaps this resurgence will endure. I hope so. But before we say that it certainly will, we should recall the axiom by Antonio Gramsci, the great Marxist theorist and Italian communist: pessimism of the intelligence, optimism of the will. In both English-speaking countries, the prospects for the left remain, for now, on an aspirational plane. Yes, Corbyn and Sanders are currently more popular than the conservatives who run governments in their countries, but it's not yet clear that the movements they lead would retain their strength or grow large enough to win a national election if either leader passed from the scene. And a left dependent on a standard bearer in his 70s is a fragile left indeed. Corbyn is the unchallenged leader of his party right now. He will undoubtedly remain so until the next general election of Britain. But Sanders will face a number of competitors for the 2020 Democratic nomination, who will seek in different ways to dilute his strong social democratic brew. They know the meld of pro-growth centrism and social liberalism that Barack Obama rode into power twice still appeals to a majority of Democratic voters, and probably a majority of American voters, and is probably more palatable to the electorate at large than the embrace of socialism. Even though when Bernie Sanders defined socialism, which he did at a long speech at my university at Georgetown last year, he said, what does socialism mean? It means what Franklin D. Roosevelt supported. It means what Lyndon Johnson supported. It means what Martin Luther King Jr. supported. He didn't reference Karl Marx, Leon Trotsky, Fidel Castro, or even Jeremy Corbyn. So why has the left declined in the 21st century? The main causes are well known, and there are many wonderful teachers of history and political science here who could give much better lectures about this topic than I can. Governments and parties of the left got blamed for initiating or cooperating in policies of austerity that made it difficult for ordinary citizens in their countries to rebound from economic hardship. Fear of immigrants and refugees courses through native-born working-class populations, both in Europe and the United States. The left on both sides of the ocean also unwittingly took on the image of what the French call la gauche caviar, a tendency shaped and dominated by self-confident, cosmopolitan men and women with degrees from elite universities, like this one. They appeared more passionate about the rights of racial, religious, and sexual minorities than about protecting the jobs and increasing the wages of their traditional constituency, the working class. It's not a good thing, I think, that there are probably more left-wing activists in Cambridge than there are in all of West Virginia. A stark reminder of this divide occurred in the recent election in Germany. It was in the poorest parts of the country, old industrial areas with the fewest immigrants, mostly in the former East, where the far-right Alternative for Germany did best. The parallel with the white working-class voters in the so-called Rust Belt, who provided Donald Trump's margin of victory, is both obvious and painful. So is the decline of the big industrial unions, like the one this guy used to run, John L. Lewis. He didn't usually dress like that, but he was down in the mines, which had social democratic agendas. The United Mine Workers, for example, had a health care plan which covered all members for free. These unions, which once represented millions of working people of all races, when the reigning metallic tropes in the Midwest referred to steel, chrome, iron ore, and coal, and not rust, have declined so precipitously that they basically have no real influence in American politics anymore. One anecdote about this: 1988 election, Michael Dukakis, former governor of this great state of Massachusetts, won West Virginia by 5 percentage points. Michael Dukakis, for all his virtues, not the kind of person you'd think of as a sort of a working class hero kind of figure. Donald Trump won West Virginia this year by 42% of the votes. And Dukakis and Trump both won their largest margins in the southern part of West Virginia, which were then coal counties and now are mostly former coal counties. Now, despite the rhetoric of Donald Trump and his protectionist allies in both parties, the number of industrial workers is not going to go up, it's only going to go down with robotization and other forces. Still at a time when the left and the institutions it did so much to build in the middle of the 20th century, what historians call the New Deal order, has clearly failed to advance a vision for native-born working-class people, it's not surprising, I think, that many of those people have shifted their allegiances to more defensive, even reactionary causes and institutions. So is the left doomed to continue along a long downward path to marginality, if not oblivion? Does it have a future worthy of living up to the positive meaning of that term? I won't keep you in suspense any longer. Does the left have a future? My answer is yes, but you probably expected that. Each has equal weight. Neither word should stand by itself. Yes, the left has a future because its ideas have a strong appeal in a world in which capitalism as an economic and social system has failed to deliver on its promise of a fairer, more secure existence for the majority of the world's population, who, by any rational definition, remain working people. In fact, since the Great Recession, even though left parties, especially in Europe, have declined in their percentage of the vote, left ideas about the economy have gained popularity, even as the organizational left has declined. Notice in this country how little support there is outside the conservative movement for cutting taxes on the rich, or opposing a raise in the minimum wage, or leaving sick, uninsured Americans to their fate. So yes, the left has a future. Its dream of equality of conditions, of a decent, creative life for everyone, regardless of their birth, or race, or region, or gender, continues to inspire millions of political activists, especially young ones, who can and will preach that secular gospel to anyone willing to hear it. In the middle of the last century, Karl Polanyi, the Hungarian leftist intellectual, who some of you have heard of and read, he put forth a vision that I think in many ways still animates the left and should animate more of the left. Polanyi called for what he called a decommodification of goods and services that every person needs, and regardless of income, should be considered their natural right to have. Healthcare, housing, education, basic transportation. They should also have the opportunity to work at a job that will assure a decent standard of living. After World War II, the most advanced social democratic governments did a good deal to fulfill that agenda for their people. They aimed, as Polanyi put it, quote, to transcend the self-regulating market by consciously subordinating it to a democratic society, to make society a distinctively human relationship of persons. Despite the electoral woes of left-wing parties, most citizens in Europe, the United States, and elsewhere demonstrate in opinion polls and in their opposition to deregulating corporations and starving the welfare state a persistent warmth about the particulars of Polanyi's vision, even if they never heard of Polanyi. As long as that remains the case, the left will have an essential role to play and a vital argument to make. The only decent society is one that practices equality, protects free expression, and fosters a sense of solidarity among its members. However, the but, just as important as the yes. The fate of a left that not just endures, but grows through the next few decades depends in part on what direction it takes. Of course, it depends a lot on what happens in the world. All the feasible options have as many pitfalls as possibilities. Now, what I want to do in this part of the talk is to lay out three main paths I think the left might follow, all of which have their contemporary defenders in this room, perhaps. I'll confine myself to the left in the United States, whose history and current politics I know better than those of other nations. But what I say, I think, has implications for other lefts as well, including some of the ones I outlined very quickly at the beginning of the talk. After all, we live perhaps in a time that, more than any time in the past, is a period when no powerful ideology stays within national boundaries for long. There is no Fifth International, nor may there ever be one. Still, both economic realities and electronic communication make it impossible to build a left, or a right for that matter, that either wants or is able to develop separately from its counterparts in other nations. I'll discuss only the options for a left that would be rigorous in its defense of democracy and civil liberties. There are other lefts in the world, certainly, and there have been in the past, often ones that controlled large countries, even empires, like the Soviet Union. But if an undemocratic left, a revived Leninist one or worse, has a bright future, It's not a future I want to be part of, and I would oppose it with all the strength my fingers could muster on the keyboard. The first option is the left that self-consciously pursues a course that has often in the United States brought it a measure of success in the past. A perpetual gadfly, a movement that is as much a cultural force as a political one. I wrote about this aspect of the left's history in a book several years ago called American Dreamers, How the Left Changed the Nation. This left included various figures. Here are some of them, and a book by one of them. Radical abolitionists like Frederick Douglass, utopian socialists like Edward Bellamy, the feminist radicals Margaret Sanger and Emma Goldman, pro-communist artists like Paul Robeson and Woody Guthrie, cartoonists like Dr. Seuss, and my favorite book by him. Today, its most prominent figure in this cultural left, perhaps, is Ta-Nehisi Coates, in many ways, who's, whenever he writes an essay, it gets discussed by hundreds of thousands of people, if not millions. The lefts they were part of certainly wanted to create a more egalitarian society, and with the partial exception of the abolitionists, all of them were open to socialist ideas. But they all did far better at helping transform the nation's moral culture, what Gramsci called the common sense of society, how Americans understand what is just and what is unjust in the conduct of daily life and public affairs. That's no small thing, by the way. Leftists who articulated these visions of a better future did much to initiate what became common, if still controversial, features of our national life, including the advocacy of equal opportunity, equal treatment for women, ethnic and racial minorities, and homosexuals, the acceptance of sexual pleasure unconnected to reproduction, a media and educational system sensitive to racial and gender oppression, and which celebrates what we now call multiculturalism, and the popularity of novels and films and songs with a strongly altruistic and anti-authoritarian point of view. Woody Guthrie. But to confine one's ambitions to achieving such changes in the texture of daily life is also an unintentional admission that one probably cannot achieve the transformation of egalitarian social and economic policies, and not to achieve such policies can make the other, more cultural gains seem hollow, and not really reach a majority of Americans in the way they live their lives. Excuse me. Consider, for example, a contemporary example. The current presence of two of the largest and most progressive unions in the nation, Service Employees Union, Mary Kay Henry, and the American Federation of Teachers, Randy Weingarten. Both women are proud lesbians. They talk about it, they're not ashamed of it. They were elected despite it or because of it, but mostly despite it for some of their members, certainly. These are some of the largest and most important unions in America today. However, the Supreme Court could soon hand down a ruling in the case of Janus versus AFSCME that would make it far difficult for these leaders and any other official of a public employees union to retain, much less expand, their memberships, to have the political influence that comes with having numbers and power at the workplace. So there's won a victory, but equality, one could argue, is farther away than ever. Put bluntly, what good is it for, let's say, a transgender person to win the right to use the bathroom of their choice if they cannot also get a job that ensures them a living wage and know the government will assure them affordable and reliable health care, whether or not they have a job? So the second option for the left has a self-evident response to that rhetorical question. A good society would provide those benefits to everyone, while continuing to advance the gains made by those whose politics are shaped more by identity than class. This alternative would be an aggressive form of social democracy, not the watered-down, business-friendly version put forth by the likes of François Hollande in France or Tony Blair in Britain, or even Barack Obama, whose liberalism was quite similar to the policies put forth by those figures and their counterparts elsewhere in Europe. It would be a social democracy whose exponents embraced Polanyi's vision and worked hard to implement it. A vision of lasting economic security, the fulfillment of Franklin Roosevelt's great speech about the four freedoms, and of Lyndon Johnson's hope for a great society that would actually abolish poverty. This kind of left would not propose doing away with the private ownership of existing businesses or the opportunity for entrepreneurs to start new ones. Labor unions would be protected by law, maybe even have some say in how their businesses are run. But workers would not own their businesses, their factories, or their offices. To quote John Judas, a friend of mine and a very fine left-wing journalist, within these parameters, families don't have to fear going hungry, losing their home, losing health insurance, and being unable to send their kids to decent schools just because someone's job is automated or their company made bad investments. The commodification of all those necessities of life. This would be a society a lot like those in Scandinavia, at least before the fear of new immigrants, many of them Muslim, gave rise to right-wing parties in those countries that bar non-citizens who don't share Nordic roots from enjoying the generosity of the welfare state, or at least try to bar those non-citizens. This kind of true social democracy may sound plausible. The market survives, but is highly regulated. Taxation is truly progressive. No loopholes for rich people who can hire clever accountants and lawyers. And it's the option for the left that Bernie Sanders has promoted pretty much explicitly, and that his popularity, if it continues to grow, may compel other liberal Democrats to embrace as well. It's an expression of what Michael Harrington, one of the founding leaders of DSA, Democratic Socialists of America, who wrote a lot for my magazine Dissent, called the left wing of the possible. Wonderful phrase. But this robust strain of social democracy also has its weaknesses. Yes, but when the heights of the economy are in private hands, politicians, even those on the left, have to be careful about regulating or taxing businesses too stringently, lest those businesses cut back on hiring and investing and move their production to other countries, which, of course, with cyber production is possible much more easily than it ever was before. So social democracy in one country, or even several countries, can run into the same basic problem as did socialism in one country that Joseph Stalin tried to implement with his tyrannical, almost genocidal rule. Even when the USSR had close allies or satellites in China, North Korea, Eastern Europe, Mongolia, it could not sustain a separate state socialist order that satisfied the demands of its citizens. And welfare states face an analogous problem, I think, in a world where every nation is now part of a global capitalist market, and most of its key industries are part of a global supply chain. The solution to this dilemma, one could argue, is a third and final option I want to outline for you today. Not social democracy, but true democratic socialism. This was the option that Marx and Engels called for and predicted would come to pass with scientific accuracy. It's what Eugene Debs and his fellow leaders of the Socialist Party of America wanted a century ago, when that party was at its historical zenith of influence and size. Leftists who advocate this kind of future argue much as those earlier leftists did. We've seen a revival in some ways of what historians would call Second International Socialism. That is a time when, before the Bolshevik Revolution, when there were all these democratic socialist parties in the world, many of them doing quite well. Two leaders of DSA, Joseph Schwartz and Bhaskar Sankara, who's the editor of the journal Jacobin, a fellow journal on the left, higher circulation than mine, recently wrote this way about this dream of democratic socialism. We can't have real democracy without economic democracy. Corporations are private governments that exercise tyrannical power over workers and society. To embrace socialist democracy, they write, is to believe that any decision that has a binding effect on its members should be made by all those affected by it. That means in a democratic socialist economy, workers would hire their managers, and those managers would be only responsible for building a content and egalitarian and productive firm. This is, in some ways, an attractive vision. It would establish a social order organized in practical ways to serve the common good. Common good, that term would not be just a throwaway line in this kind of society in a campaign speech. But the obstacles to achieving democratic socialism are quite formidable, perhaps even more formidable than to achieving social democracy. First of all, one has to ask a question. Who supports this kind of left today? What institutions exist to promote it and to fight for it? How would it encourage the kind of innovation that has resulted under capitalism in a gradually rising standard of living for most people in the world, even as the gap between the majority and the small elite at the top has grown wider. But nevertheless, the standard of living itself has increased. Fewer people dying of hunger, fewer people dying of preventable diseases, and so forth. Now, if leftists had convincing answers to those questions, we would probably know them. But Schwartz and Sankara, in their essay, which is quite stirring in many ways, devote just one sentence to how such a future might come about. And this is what they say. We would need a militant labor movement and a mass socialist presence strengthened by accumulated victories, looking to not merely tame but overcome capitalism, end quote. I mean, I can't think of a single country in the world which has a left that fits that description. So in today's United States, perhaps, sadly, it's less akin to the lyrics of John Lennon's Imagine, but without one of the most popular artists in the world around to sing its virtues. So at least for now, democratic socialism resembles the left wing of the impossible. Whichever option the American left pursues, it will have to find a way to solve several difficult dilemmas it wrestles with today. And don't worry, at the end, which I'm getting to, I'll talk about options, possibilities, some hopeful things. Let me mention three of the most important dilemmas, each widely debated on the left today. First and foremost, race. As we know all too well, racial inequality and conflict are now and have always been central facts of U.S. history. Recall that at least 10% of American men, North and South, were casualties of the Civil War, which President Drew Faust has written eloquently about. That war, its legacy, the battle over slavery that caused it, continued to roil our politics and our culture, as the current debate over Confederate monuments and the memory of Robert E. Lee certainly attest. Now, since the 1920s, the left has often played a really sort of vanguard role, to use an old left phrase, in combating racism and racial inequality. One of the best things the Communist Party ever did. Henry Wallace's campaign, which Liz mentioned in her campaign, Henry Wallace refused to speak in front of segregated audiences, even in the South, which meant he didn't get to speak very much in the South. But if you make a priority of fighting racial inequality, it poses an obvious problem. How do you unite Americans of different races if you're busy defending the rights and interests of a minority of Americans? Now, in most European nations with relatively homogeneous populations, the left was able to appeal effectively to class identities and resentments alone. At least they were until the expansion of immigration from Africa and the Middle East made that much more difficult. But the US left has never been able to make a credible argument that all working class people share the same lot and the same grievances, because it hasn't been true. This is no less a problem today. As Bernie Sanders showed in his presidential campaign last year, a politics focusing on attacking finance capitalism and proposing universal social programs, Medicare for all, $15 an hour minimum wage, can win millions of votes. But Black Lives Matter activists, some of whom have been on demonstrations like this, protested that Sanders was saying little about racist policing and incarceration. Some argue that neglect of those issues, so important to young activists and African-American activists and those who support them generally, might have cost him the support of enough black voters to defeat Hillary Clinton for the nomination. Whether or not that's correct, the charge they made underlines a larger dilemma. If leftists make fighting racism their top priority, they may find it hard, if not impossible, to gain support from white working class people who refuse to feel guilty about their attitudes or behavior, but might be won over to a broader appeal to their economic interests. However, to take the latter course can mean underplaying the ongoing injuries of racial inequality and muting those who protest them. That's why it's a dilemma. A second dilemma, for leftists of all stripes, except the most sectarian ones, what are you going to do about the Democratic Party? Liz talked a lot about that in introduction. Since Franklin Roosevelt was elected in 1932, National Democrats have clearly been a more progressive force on nearly every issue than have their Republican opponents. When the Democrats dominated American politics from the 1930s to the end of the 1960s, they represented a weaker equivalent of the social democratic parties of Western Europe. As in Europe, they could count on the loyalty of most working class voters from all regions of the nation. As the head of Radcliffe Institute, Dean of Radcliffe Institute, wrote brilliantly in her first book, Making a New Deal, these working class Americans both black and white, made the New Deal through a common popular culture and union activism as much as Democrats made it for them. Now, over the years, despite their criticisms and misgivings, most leftists have swallowed their doubts and voted for most Democratic candidates in most state and federal elections. But since the 1960s, Democrats have not endorsed more than a few items on the left's agenda, either domestic or foreign. Given the realities of American politics in a more conservative era, if they did so, they feared being relegated to minority status for a long time to come. Still, I firmly believe that all leftists should be Democrats, capital D and small d. Despite needing and getting campaign funds from Wall Street and executives in Silicon Valley, the Democratic Party is also an institution that's quite open to participation by individuals and groups at nearly every level, from county committees to campaign staffs to elections of delegates to the quadrennial convention. That means there are plenty of opportunities to nudge the party to the left. And most of the organizations that work for liberal causes, which include a lot of leftists in them as well, from the Sierra Club to the AFL-CIO to the NAACP to MALDEF, routinely endorse Democratic candidates, if only because the alternative is far worse. They understand that the lesser evil is also the only party they have. But if one wants to advance either social democracy or democratic socialism, throwing a lot into the Democrats has obvious disadvantages as well. If you run a left-wing primary campaign and lose, then you face pressure to back the winning candidate or incur blame if he or she loses. And division and conflict become inevitable, as it still is happening around the Democratic Party today after the 2016 election. This is particularly a problem now because Democrats are out of power in the federal government and in most of the states. The party has come to resemble what my friend Todd Gitlin calls a massive dumbbell, both demographically and regionally. It's strong among well-educated professionals at one end of the dumbbell, like most of us in this auditorium, and among black and Latino, poor, and working-class people on the other end. And the only states that vote reliably Democratic in presidential elections and most senatorial races are those on the East Coast and the West Coast. Another dumbbell. When he was running for president as a socialist, Eugene Debs declared, "I'd rather vote for something I want and not get it than for something I don't want and get it." But a century later, with conservatives in command of the Republican Party, with the Republican Party in charge of the government, the alternative is not that simple. What do you do when the choice is between a candidate who gives you some things you want, who's running against a candidate opposed to everything you cherish? In Debs' day, things were somewhat different. The socialists were as strong in Oklahoma and Ohio as they were in New York and California. They elected hundreds, thousands actually, of local officials in every region of the country, except the Deep South. But to vote for a third party of the left today, say the Green Party, is just a way of helping the right-wing party win. It's political malpractice, a form of self-abuse. The third dilemma for the future of the left involves nothing less than the future of the planet. The urgency to curb climate change is one of the few causes that unites everyone from moderate Democrats to revolutionary socialists. But until or unless most of the world adopts renewable, non-carbon forms of energy, serious solutions to climate change will mean limits on economic growth. And since the left began at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution 200 years ago, it has depended on growth to make it possible to fight for and win increases in wages, improvements in living conditions, and modest redistributions of wealth. Depressions increase resentment by the have-nots against the haves, that's true. But only when the economy begins to recover or is booming are lefts able to build mass organizations and make positive changes in the lives of ordinary people. Today, many working people fear that environmentalists, most of whom lead comfortable lives, want to do away with jobs that produce or use massive supplies of fossil fuels. This helps drive support for Republicans in several key states, like West Virginia. Climate change. March in Washington recently. And leftists' answer to that is to play up the promise of green industries in the future. But they have little to offer someone working today on an oil rig or building a pipeline, in many cases who happens to be a union member. So to quote a very famous, very undemocratic leftist who took power in Russia almost exactly 100 years ago this week, what is to be done? Let me conclude by mentioning three guidelines, I think, essential to any viable future democratic American left. First of all, institutions matter profoundly. Lefts everywhere are quite good at mounting protests that raise issues which get infused to a wider public debate. The Indignados in Spain back in 2010 did this. They helped spawn the Occupy uprising in the United States in the fall of 2011. Both groups made economic inequality, the 1% versus the 99%, impossible to ignore. Black Lives Matter has done the same for police killings of unarmed black men. But none of these insurgencies has much of a visible presence today. So leftists have to build new institutions or join or urge others to join the ones that already exist, whether unions, immigrant rights groups, older organizations like the ACLU, local Democratic parties. Unlike groups like Indivisible that have sprung up to oppose Donald Trump and his Republican enablers, these have to be equipped to last beyond the next election and not rely solely on social media to mobilize and educate people. Women and men of the left, more I think than their counterparts on the right and center, who tend to put their faith in leaders, looking for the next Reagan all the time, have to learn to trust one another through hours and hours of debate and months of common activism. You can't build that kind of trust with a series of tweet storms or meetups or one-shot demonstrations. Second, leftists need liberals just as much as liberals need leftists. In U.S. history, the only periods when significant, rapid progress was made towards greater equality and expanded democratic rights occurred when a growing left abetted liberal politicians and a liberal state, not without tensions and misgivings on both sides, of course. This is true of the Civil War and Reconstruction, of the Progressive Era, of the 1930s and World War II, and the 1960s. Now, the left, as we know, has never been as large or powerful in the United States as it has been in most other industrial and post-industrial countries. It's never come close to capturing even a share of federal power. Yet it has at times been large and powerful enough to create and lead social movements that shifted the policies of the state leftward. And one example of that is this relationship between this man and the President of the United States. We have a national holiday dedicated to a man who called himself, in private, a democratic socialist. Not Lyndon Johnson, Martin Luther King Jr. But to do that, they had to pursue an inside-outside strategy to build a movement of their own, as King and his allies, of course, did, while also making alliances, however contentious, with men and women who were able to win state and national office. And for the foreseeable future, that's going to mean liberals. Third, empathy is mandatory. Leftists need to speak and act like people who believe they can convince a majority of Americans, one hopes a large majority of Americans, to support their views, and who trust them to change the nation in ways that will benefit them, not just us. That requirement goes beyond advocating universal social programs, canvassing and voting for politicians who can actually win elections. It means coming to terms with who those people really are. As the progressive journalist Michael Tomasky wrote recently in the Daily Beast, quote, "These people in middle America have very different sensibilities than elite liberals," and he could have added radicals, who live on the coasts. They tend to attend church more regularly, own more guns, and don't feel self-conscious saluting the flag. Tomasky could have added, as a group, they also are poorer and less educated, with fewer chances of markedly improving their economic well-being anytime soon. Of course, racial and nativist fears and animosities endure. One reason why white people in red states vote consistently and overwhelmingly Republican today. Still, the injuries of class, wonderful term that Richard Sennett and Jonathan Cobb wrote about in a book mostly based on Boston working-class people in the early 1970s, those injuries of class are more routine and fester longer in the red states than they do in most blue states. A left that cannot empathize with these people, that persists in mocking and dismissing their religion and their patriotism, is a left that will never achieve either its social democratic or its democratic socialist ambitions. Neither will be able to help liberals win a durable electoral mandate. Bertolt Brecht declared, "Change the world, it needs it." But to do so, we have to persuade people who disagree with us now that the change that's needed will be good for them as well as good for us. For the left, there is no more vital task, or in the despicable reign of Donald Trump, none that is more urgent. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm
Thank
Wendy
you.
Kaminer. I have a quick question. You've made a case for pragmatism, basically. Vote Democratic, settle for some of what you want instead of collaborating in the destruction of everything that you value. I don't see much of a thirst for pragmatism on the left, especially among younger voters. I certainly don't remember much of a taste for pragmatism when I was young among people who were politically active. And I'm wondering if you do, and how you address that problem.
No, very important question. Pragmatism, of course, philosophically, as you know, is about consequences of actions being the most important thing, not the, ideas themselves. I think today I was having lunch with some students that the Institute put together a lunch, and I was asked a very similar question, and I was thinking back to when I was a student at Harvard, co-chair of SDS during the Harvard strike, and talk about being unpragmatic. Now, we wanted to stop the war, but we also wanted to, bring down the whole system as quickly as possible and didn't really care too much about how we did it. And I don't think we brought Winston Nixon to power. He was in power already by early 1969, but we certainly didn't help George McGovern very much in 1972. Anyway, I actually am more optimistic about, because I work with people on dissent about, where's the person who asked me the questions? Hi, sorry, I want to look at you while I talk to you. I think, they really didn't like Hillary Clinton at all, but they ended up voting for, at least the people I know. They realized that socialism won't be built in a day. And they don't talk about revolution very much. I mean, Bernie Sanders has, Our Revolution is his website and his book, but, he means that obviously rhetorically, not let's put together an army and smash the state. And so I think, it's a battle because obviously when young people, anybody really becomes radical and comes to a sense of, my God, the whole world is unequal and terrible and we need a decent society, then you want to get there as quickly as possible. I think it's a battle. It's a battle within DSA, this organization which has grown so much. There's a battle of the Democratic Party to a certain degree, how you do that. And, politics is about compromise on the left as well as in general. And so I guess I'm more optimistic than you are, in part because I think when I talk to my, people on the editorial staff of Dissent in New York, and when I talk to, left-wing students at Georgetown and elsewhere, they understand, yes, we have to vote for Democrats, though they argue with some people who don't agree with them, but still there's a sense that there really is no alternative, though they hate there's no alternative. Now, some people argue, we have to build a third party as soon as possible because there is no alternative. So that's a lot of the debate. But, in some ways, 40 years or so of basically conservative dominance of the discourse in our politics, not necessarily all the government at all times, I think is a sobering thing. Back in the 1960s when I was 20, 21 years old and trying to do as much damage to Harvard as possible, we were coming out of a liberal period, out of a period of when we thought all things were possible. That was part of what gave rise to the movements of the 60s and helped to understand. And for us, liberals were the enemy, because they were fighting a war in Vietnam, which is a terrible war. So, leading a war in Vietnam. So that's a long, rambling answer to it could be worse. and I think there's an argument to be made there. And inevitably, and it's a good thing that people have utopian ideas. Let's do away with all the prisons. Let's do away with all the police. That's a debate in DSA, for example, right now. But at the same time, people who say that, I think, would be quite willing to have, fewer prisons and fewer nonviolent criminals in jail and better jails. And back in the 60s, when we talked about revolution, we really meant it, though we had no idea how to get there.
Jay Gleason. War Against War is a really interesting book because, in part, it calls attention.
I'm sorry.
War Against War
Thank you.
is an interesting book, partly because it calls attention to how little is left of the anti-war movement, especially since you were on the Cambridge Common in the moratorium and in SDS. But when you look at there was rarely a peep of protest when Obama was bombing 7 different countries. Clinton's foreign policy could have been written by Dick Cheney. Even Bernie Sanders didn't like discussing foreign policy. So we're at a point where you say that leftists and liberals, which are 2 different groups, need to come up with a foreign policy that solves the problems of the world rather than adding to them. But you don't get any more specific than that. Liberals obviously are very comfortable with a unipolar world, with imperialism. Leftists are generally anti-imperialist. So how do you reconcile those different positions? Someone like Obama believes very firmly in American exceptionalism, which leads to a lot of these problems. Part of the problem with the left has always been factionalism, especially when it comes to foreign policy. Where do you go with that?
It's a good question, and thanks for reading my book, if you don't agree with all of it. Since Vietnam, I think, the left, with some exceptions like anti-apartheid, supporting, left-wing governments and supporters in Nicaragua, El Salvador, solidarity movements, has not known really what to say, I think, about foreign policy. And that's even more true since the Cold War ended, and even more true since 9/11 in many ways. Michael Walzer, my former co-editor, a very great political theorist who I studied with here at Harvard, and then co-edited Dissent with him, says for the left, the default foreign policy is a good domestic policy. I think it has something to do about it because, Bernie Sanders, you said, it wasn't that he had a bad foreign policy, good foreign policy. He didn't have much for foreign policy. Hardly said anything about foreign policy. I don't agree that Barack Obama, was say just as bad as George W. Bush, but it's certainly true that leftists, there's no countries in the world they identify with the way some leftists identify with the Soviet Union or China or Cuba. Even Scandinavia is sort of less of a shining light for social democrats these days, as I suggested. So that's a problem, because going back in American history, the Socialist Party identified very strongly with the Socialist Party in Germany, the SPD back in Debs's day. And that, of course, fell apart after World War I. So I wish I could tell you how to do that. Part of the problem is that Americans, I think, it's not just leftists who think that the best foreign policy is a good domestic policy. Most Americans feel that same way. I wouldn't say most Americans are isolationists, but most Americans really only care about the world if the world's going to attack them and hurt them, as with terrorism. And so how do you make that argument? I'm afraid, I hate to sound pessimistic, I'm afraid it will take a crisis, perhaps like the Iraq War again. I think the one issue Americans do care about, which is an international issue, is climate change. And I think, in some ways, talking about how climate change can hurt poor people in the world more is one way into making Americans care more about that. But, let's face it, most citizens of most countries in the world don't really care that much about the foreign policy of their nations unless it's not working very well. As long as it's working well, they're willing to let it go because their lives, they feel it doesn't really involve their interests. So, but thanks for the question. Get some water. Hold on a second. Yeah.
Hi, Professor. I'm Emily Dreyfus. Thank you so much. You mentioned some ways forward, and those included that we need on the left to have empathy and include that in all of our public discourse. One thing I didn't hear you talk about was money and how we on the left can organize and fund such organization. And I'm thinking so much lately about how the right seems to have so much organized money behind it, and that whether or not we understood the power of all of that funding, it really has given them an intense power that we lack, possibly because we're more factionalized. And I just wonder, do you think that, I'm sure we have a future, but do we have a chance to actually beat that side if we don't have such an organized and well-funded central system?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I deal with this all the time in my magazine because we have a budget that's probably a little more than the salary of a tenured Harvard law professor. But maybe, I don't want to, assume. But, we're constantly trying to raise money just for that, and through grants and, different kinds of subscription deals and that kind of stuff. Obviously the difference between the right and the left is that the right's in favor of unregulated capitalism, and we're not. So, I mean, there's a good reason why the Kochs, give so much money to the right, because people they give to want to help the Kochs, as well as they have a more general libertarian worldview. I don't want to be unfair to the Kochs. They do have beliefs as well as interests. But, I think that's part of the reason why the decline of unions is so such much of a problem for not just liberals but leftists too, because unions used to fund a lot of campaigns and still do when they still exist and are strong. Every time I've ever canvassed for a candidate, not every time, a lot of times we meet in union halls. At least we used to, not so much anymore. And of course they probably still the single most important contributor to Democratic campaigns are labor unions. I don't know for sure. I mean, I think there have to be imaginative ways to put together, sort of crowdsourcing funding. Maybe if you join an organization, you have to agree to give a certain amount of money. I'm not sure. And there, of course, are sympathetic people with lots of money, like Tom Steyer, who right now I think is pursuing the quixotic aim of impeaching Donald Trump rather than giving money to candidates like he should. But anyway, if you listen to me, Tom, you're probably not. And you need some more of those people. I mean, one of the reasons why I think, Democratic Party is the only party, if Bernie Sanders had gotten the nomination, he would have had a hard time raising money, You could say, people would have given small amounts, and they would have. That's certainly true. But, that's not enough to go against the ads that the Republicans would have run against him and will run against him if he gets the nomination in 2020. I won't tell you what those ads are going to be, but you can imagine. You got to counter those ads, and that takes money. I dearly wish we could get away from that. My friend Miles Rappaport's in the crowd here. He was a leader, still a leader in trying to change our horrible campaign finance system, but as far as I know, that hasn't happened yet, even though he's a founder of Demos and helped really try to put a lot of good ideas about that out there. So I think we have to try to change that system, actually. That's really the best way to do it, at least for elections. For other movement activity, that's somewhat easier to fund, I think. Doesn't need as much money. Thank you.
Jonathan Martin, I appreciated a lot of what you had to say, but I wonder if the claim that voting for a third party is political malpractice is far too sweeping. After all, Bernie Sanders himself emerged from a third-party movement in Vermont, which has exerted leverage to push the Democratic Party to the left in Vermont. There is a history of third parties affecting policy, even if they only win a small portion of seats, which I'm sure you're aware of. On top of that, major parties don't last forever. There's the history of the Republican Party starting out as a third party. And finally, there are many state legislative elections where there's only one party running, about 40% of state legislative elections. In that case, the spoiler dynamic doesn't even exist, and third parties could be a viable choice. What about that?
No, that's very well put. And I certainly should have put caveats in there, and I didn't want to talk too long about any one part of the subjects of my talk. No, it's certainly true, especially in very strongly blue areas, perhaps like Cambridge, sort of like D.C. where I live, where Hillary Clinton won 93% of the vote. New York City, New York State, the Working Families Party, which you might know, is able to run their own candidates, but also there's a law in New York, very few states have, where they can fuse for the general election with the Democrats, so they don't actually run the risk of electing a Republican. Historically, third parties have often served a great role. The great historian Richard Hofstadter said, third parties are like bees. They sting and then they die. And that was true of the People's Party. It was not true of the Republican Party. It was true of the People's Party, the Socialist Party in many ways. Even the Progressive Party of Henry Wallace and the Progressive Party of Robert La Follette earlier in 1924. But I'm talking about today's politics, talking about the future of the left. And here I think there's such a difference really on most issues, and I would argue this despite people talking about neoliberalism and so forth, between national Democrats at least and national Republicans on really important issues of reform and regulation and healthcare and on, that if you run a third party for national elections, or in most states, I'd say, not Vermont, necessarily, where I think the Democrats have basically stopped running a candidate against Bernie anyway, right? Then I think you do make it much more easy for the other side to win. I mean, Jill Stein won enough votes in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin if those people had voted for Hillary Clinton to elect Hillary Clinton. Now, obviously a lot of those people would not have voted for Hillary Clinton, whatever, or they wouldn't have voted at all if Jill Stein wasn't on the ballot. But still, I think, what's the point of having Jill Stein running for president when the Green Party, if the Green Party was a party with the kind of membership and press and entree to different populations that the Socialist Party had 100 years ago, then I might think differently. But it doesn't. And to build that kind of party, I think, as I said, I think you can build a stronger left within the Democratic Party and don't have to worry about a more sort of pure radical party, which can run the risk of doing what Ralph Nader did in 2000. So we'll disagree. It depends where, is my point. I agree about legislative elections. Yeah.
Hey, so I noticed that you didn't really mention any contemporary leaders or groups aside from Bernie Sanders, who, as you point out, will be
and DSA.
close to 80,
Yeah.
right? DSA, and you were Black Lives Matter and Indivisible, which you raised some concern about. So, do you see any leaders or any organizations at the national or state level that could lead this kind of resurgence, or do you think there's just a total vacuum?
I think, it'll be a coalition. It won't be one group or one leader, which is probably good in some ways because people have to learn to work together. And of course, part of the problem, it's more with liberals than leftists, but is that I talked about conservatives always looking for the next Reagan. In some ways, liberals are always looking for the next Obama, or before that, John Kennedy, something like that, who will lead them out of the wilderness. Eugene Debs said, he's great quotations. He said, if I could lead you out of the wilderness, I could lead you right back again. And so I think we should be suspicious of candidates, of politicians, especially ones who run for president. You got to be a little crazy to run for president, I think, but given the powers you'll have. But no, I think it'll be a coalition of these groups. That's why I was talking about some of these dilemmas, because leftists who stand on one side of the dilemma or another have to figure out ways to cooperate with one another. I'm a member of DSA. I think that's an important organization if you consider yourself a socialist of one kind or another, democratic one kind or another. I'm to the right probably of a lot of the people in DSA, but then I'm almost 70 years old, so that would stand to reason. I think, find yourself an organization and fight within it and work within it. Because in the end, as I said, it's about institutions and putting institutions together. And elections are obviously draw people's attention, but it's what you do before the election that really matters, of course.
But there's a number of threats of primary challenges and primary challenges happening on the Democratic side in these midterms. So are any of those, has anyone stood out to you?
Oh, specific candidates?
Yeah, anybody.
Trying to think. I'm trying to think of Senate races and gubernatorial races.
Yeah.
There was a guy in Virginia who lost the primary, Tom Perriello,
right.
who had won in a pretty red district for Congress, you might know, and he lost the primary to a guy who's basically a liberal, Ralph Northam. And he lost by 11 points, and Perriello had some of the same problems that Bernie Sanders had. Everybody who doesn't care about Virginia politics, you can look at your phones now. Because he didn't really have much appeal to black voters, especially older black voters. He didn't have much to say to them. He didn't try that hard, unfortunately. And he mostly ran against how terrible Donald Trump was, which, part of the problem, I didn't say this explicitly, but it should be assumed in almost everything I said. You got to find candidates who can say something, who can sum up their vision, and I would say a more radical vision, succinctly and powerfully. And Bernie Sanders could do that, but most people who run Democratic primaries are not very good at it, So I'm trying to think of another candidate comes to mind, but the fact that no candidate does come to mind is itself perhaps clear. And part of the problem too is to win elections as Democrats, you have to win a lot of money, so make a lot of money. And one of the best things Bernie Sanders did, I think, is that he got some young people on the left to run for office. I have a student right now who's 19 years old, and he worked for Bernie Sanders last year, and he's going to run for state senate in Connecticut, in some district that some older Republican has held for a long time, and basically this Republican is hardly bothers to campaign, and people keep electing her anyway. And my student is 19 years old. He'll be 20 by the time of the election or something, and who knows if he's going to win? But that's a great sign, And I think we need more people whose names we don't know to run for office on more left-wing platforms. Thanks.
Hi, Professor. I was wondering, are you following contemporary developments of the left in other countries, and how do you read them in the context of what's happening in the US? And do you think solidarities could be built across nations?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. I mentioned some of that in passing at the beginning, of course. And partly because, a lot because I edit Dissent. We run articles about left in other countries. We just had a couple probably controversial articles about Catalonian independence, for example, which is not just the left, but of course, Catalonia in Spain has always been the more left-wing part of Spain, at least the last 100 years or so. We run articles on the left in different countries, more on Europe traditionally than other countries, but we're branching out to run more on Latin America, for example, and India, and China, where there needs to be a left, of course, even though the government calls itself, still socialism with Chinese characteristics. So yeah, international solidarity is important. Michael Walzer has a new book coming out next month or the month after, called The Left in Foreign Policy, a lot of which he published in Dissent originally. And his foreign policy, this is an answer to the gentleman who asked me about foreign policy before, I should have mentioned it when he asked me, is people on the left should support people like them, in effect, in other countries. That's the best kind of solidarity. And I think I agree with that. I don't think that's the whole thing. If Bernie Sanders gets the Democratic nomination, he's going to have to say what to do about, the Pentagon. He's not going to be able to avoid that little question. But I think it is important to, study and identify people on the left in other countries and make connections with them. We have on Dissent very good connections with a Polish New Left group called Krytyka Polityczna, excuse my Polish, which is mostly young, leftist intellectuals, like people who work for Dissent. That's obviously the kind of thing we're going to be doing. We're going to have, we just got a nice grant, or we're about to get a nice grant from a group I will not name, to put together a big conference of democratic socialism in Latin America, which will be in New York City about a year from now. So yes, obviously. But of course, that's not necessarily going to, help build the left in this country, but it certainly gets Americans out of their idea that America is the center of the world, whether a bad center or a good center, but nevertheless the center. So thanks for the question.
Thank you.
I'm Heather Remoff, and thank you for your talk. I particularly like the idea that a unifying goal of the various factions of the left is equality. I'm concerned with economic equality and see monopolies as a barrier to achieving economic equality, particularly monopolies of the commons in nature. And I just wonder...
Especially in what?
Monopolies of the commons in nature, mineral reserves, clean air, clean water, those kinds of things. And I just wonder if you have any thoughts or ideas of how we most effectively could address monopoly in this country.
Well, one of the things if I give a more general lecture about the left in American history, I would have mentioned, but anti-monopoly was probably the most common tendency that united different kinds of leftists in American history, beginning, some would argue with, oppositions to the Second Bank of the United States, but certainly since after the Civil War, during the Gilded Age. Populists talked about it, socialists talked about it, anarchists talked about it, antitrust reformers, of course, talked about it.
Don't talk about it now very much.
No, well, people are starting to, actually. There's, at least where I am in D.C., there are people, Elizabeth Warren talks about it, your senator. Not a socialist, but certainly a left liberal, certainly anti-monopolist, I think. And, a lot of this scandal about the Russians putting all this stuff on Facebook and Twitter during the last election, try to sway the vote, gets people thinking about that as well. The problem, as always, with making that argument is, monopolists also deliver a lot of stuff people want, When I'm working on a new book, I must say the first thing I think about when I think about buying a book that was published 100 years ago is I look on Amazon, because all those great secondhand dealers, we can sell it to you real cheap and deliver it right to your door.
Get royalties on those secondhand books. As
100 years ago, not getting royalties anyway. No, it's a real problem. As always, you need an alternative. You need to say, okay, how can I get all the stuff from Amazon without Amazon, doing it? And that's always the question. This is a question going back to the progressive era. Woodrow Wilson and Theodore Roosevelt argued about new freedom versus the new nationalism, and Roosevelt wanted more regulation of corporations, and Wilson, at least rhetorically, wanted to break up the monopolies. But no, I think it's something that really has to be focused on. And, but of course, it's, again, as anything in politics, it's got to be based on grievances people have. It can't just be based on big is bad. That doesn't convince people. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Jitendra Singh. My question has to do with, it's actually a variant of a question that was asked a little while ago. It has to do with the fact that here we are in Cambridge, Massachusetts, a reliably blue state. And in order for us to have any impact on the national political scene, we really have to build alliances with people and groups that are outside of here, in order to really be effective. And so my question has to do with, who do we build such alliances with, and is there a leader, or set of leaders for that matter, who can help marshal the tremendous amount of energy that we have here towards making a difference?
Yeah. When people ask me questions like that, my first impulse is to say, hey, I'm just a historian. Let me tell you about the past. I wish we had him around. Not him, King. I think he was probably the greatest leader of the left in American history in many ways. All I can say is, look, I think you need to get involved in whatever issue, institution you feel the most passionate about, and make sure that institution can grow and can make more of those connections and coalitions. And everyone has their own way of doing that. I think one of the reasons unions were so important, and can still be important, I hope, in the future, is because they are about what people do every day at their workplace. You don't have to say, I think I'll leave work and go to a meeting which is about something that is not really about my daily life, but about what's happening in South Africa, which is important, but not going to have much effect. Politics does begin where people live, and yet it doesn't stop there. And I think you've got to, I don't know, what you do and who your friends are, and what institutions you're already part of. But I would figure out, which institution, what group of friends, can best link up with people in other states who work on either that issue or that campaign. I'm just giving you methodology. I'm not giving you an answer, but if I were a politician, I'd say vote for me, but I'm not a politician.
Thank you.
So I think we have signal that's the last question, right?
Yep.
Yeah, so anyway, it's been great. Thank you very much for your questions and for your attention.